And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker. Shanondora Billiot is a member of the United Human Nation and has a PhD in social work from Washington University in St. Louis. She holds a Master's of Social Work from the University of Michigan and both Bachelor's of Arts and Bachelor's of Science degrees from Louisiana State University. Prior to coming to Illinois, she had 10+ experience working in the field from crisis intervention and post-disaster grassroots community development to implementing and analyzing federal and international health and mental health policies. Her current research uses mixed methods to explore Indigenous specific factors like connection to land, historical trauma and discrimination, and their relationship to global environmental change, exposure, and health outcomes, among a sample of her tribal community currently located along the Gulf Coast of Southeast Louisiana. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Billiot.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bonjour. Mi nom es Shanondora Billiot. Mi papá es Charles Billiot del Coteau y papá es Charles Billiot du Lac y Ami Billiot del Ponechet. Thank you. I would like to start off by acknowledging the ancestors of many Indigenous communities who maintain the land which we are standing on today. I start off by introducing you in my colonized language that my grandparents spoke, because it's the way that shows that I'm Homa and where I'm from, so that way it orients you to my perspective. I'm going to be talking to you today about my dissertation research, which looked at environmental changes and how health among Homa members was impacted and their shared cultural experiences. I'm going to just start off by telling you about how I am a social worker, but I look at environment. I, in 2005, graduated from LSU, was working as a crisis intervention counselor, and that summer, Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita happened. At the same time as working as a crisis intervention counselor, I was, for my National Guard assignment, was assigned to the general who coordinated disaster response efforts. And I had this incredibly unique opportunity to see social workers and their response galvanizing communities, churches, and their network to get people out of danger, into shelter, and already starting to work on recovery plans. Where in my National Guard assignment, I saw governments organizations still arguing over who was going to pay to feed the state troopers to close the roads to make for one-way traffic. So I had this unique opportunity to see how amazing social workers are, and I came into the social work field with this deep understanding of how environment directly impacts our society, our culture, and our individual lives. So I knew going into a PhD program that I wanted to work with my community, and I went to my tribal council my first year in the program, which can be even more intimidating than speaking before all of you, to ask permission to work with the community. And I expressed my desire in studying disasters and mental health, and they debated for a while and then said to me that, you know, that's nice that you want to work on this, that you recognize that we are having all these disasters, and that's something that you think that the Academy would be interested in. But we experience repeated disasters, and after every disaster, media, academics, people from around the world come in and take our knowledge like drones and leave. And nobody's really looking at the chronic repeated loss of our lands and what's happening to our health of repeated disasters. Is that something that you can work on? And I said, I don't know, but I will try. So thank you for this opportunity. And so I went back to my academic institution and saw that in literature, it reflected what the tribal council said, that yes, we do have interventions looking at acute onset, time delineated events. In fact, social workers can respond anywhere between hours before to sometimes responses last up to 36 months. However, we don't know what's happening with ongoing chronic environmental changes. And for kind of understanding so that way we're all on the same page, I'm defining global environmental changes as changes to the physical and biogeochemical environment that is caused either naturally or accelerated by human activities. And these human activities that we do are deforestation, fossil fuel consumption, urbanization, overexploitation, and overconsumption leading to waste, inefficient waste production. Global environmental changes include disasters, but it also includes changes to our long-term climatic cycles like climate change that is directly caused by human activities. All of these changes, as you know, have impacts on biodiversity, water, ecosystems, and human health. For me, what's incredibly important for the HOMA is in Louisiana, coastal erosion has been the cause of about 34 square miles of land loss per year for the last 50 years. And if that is kind of hard for you to think about how much land that is, that's about the size of the state of Delaware. And if nothing is done to stop it, in the next 50 years, we will lose an additional size about the Washington, D.C., Baltimore area. Terrebonne Parish, I'm sorry, my community is 17,000 members over a 6-parish area. Terrebonne Parish is in the area of Louisiana that has lost over 61% of this land. And the parish seat, the county seat, is named Homa after my tribe. These communities are among the most socially vulnerable by experiencing high rates of poverty, low socioeconomic status, poor and deteriorating physical infrastructure, as well as among the top 3 physically vulnerable coastal communities in the United States. But what's happening in Louisiana and among the Homa is not just happening to my Indigenous community. It's happening globally with Indigenous communities. About 22% of the land surface on Earth is managed, used, or owned by approximately 370 million Indigenous peoples who live in about 70 countries and constitute over 5,000 separate groupings. This means that approximately 6% of our world's landmass is managed, owned, or utilized by over 80% of, manages over 80% of the world's biodiversity. Although Indigenous peoples around the world contribute the least to environmental changes, they are disproportionately impacted because of their proximity to these vulnerable ecosystems, and because of social, spiritual, cultural, and traditional lifestyles that are deeply reliant on natural resources for subsistence and cultural activities. For example, many Indigenous peoples have their creation stories of how they originated incorporated in some way with the environment. And again, so that way we're kind of all on the same page. I'm defining as Indigenous peoples as peoples or nations who take their tribal identities as members of human species from the landscapes and seascapes that gave them their unique tribal cultures. This leads to incredible and disproportionate health disparities between Indigenous peoples and their majority counterparts. For example, in the United States, some of the more alarming health disparities among Indigenous peoples is that compared to majority counterparts, Indigenous peoples experience depression 60% more likely to experience depression, and 2 times more likely to develop diabetes later in life. As I mentioned, there's these historical events that have contributed to health disparities, as well as displacement from original lands. You can see the top corner, the top box is where Houma was located at contact with French in the 1500s. And because of colonial land laws from the French, then Spanish, and then the United States, we were systematically removed from our lands, displaced from our lands to the Gulf Coast, where we are, for now, located. And then a third reason for health disparities, particularly in the United States, is an undervaluing of health practices. For many Indigenous communities, health is a holistic concept that is in balance with not just the individual in the community, but also the environment. And a sickness or an imbalance is returning to balance through ceremonies and offerings and healing, a holistic healing. Whereas we participate in healing through an individual going to a doctor that is separated from community, as well as not valuing practices of medicines that were traditionally used in Indigenous communities. Some of the historical events also have led to low formalized education, high poverty, and high rates of negative health and mental health outcomes. In the red, you will see rates for Houma, so having lower, in comparison with the state of Louisiana and the United States, having lower rates of high school graduation, lower rates of overall household earnings, higher rates of unemployment, and hypertension, diabetes, and depression. I will explain my dissertation research that I've done, and of course I situated this within theory, and I've used statistical methods. I will be happy to answer all of those questions, but so that way I can present to the larger audience. I will just present what questions that I actually asked. So using the theories and the Indigenous knowledge that was shared with me, I had 4 major questions. First, following James Ford's recommendation for establishing adaptation practices is first to understand baseline of how the population is experiencing or exposed to environmental changes. And that has not been quantified in the US until this particular study. So my first question was to ask, what is the level of exposure, environmental change exposure among Houma? And that's measured through how they observe changes in their environment, how they experience it, and how they feel it's threatening their life or their family. The second question is about health, and asking questions of their self-reported health, their mental health, and general health. And there's not a comprehensive healthcare system that serves all of the tribe, and so this overall knowledge is not really known. The statistics I've given you are from small needs assessment surveys. So I ask, what's the prevalence of mental and physical health? The third question is asking, is there a relationship between environmental change exposure and health outcomes? And then because so many people in the 4 years prior to me doing my dissertation talked about their traumas that they experienced and the discrimination, but they also talked about resilience, what we call protective factors. So social support, having lots of social support in the community, and their identity serving as a protective factor. I looked to see if there was any interactions between environmental change exposure and health outcomes. Also, knowing that measures only give a percentage of voice, a very structured voice to Indigenous communities, and so I wanted to ask, let them articulate in their words through qualitative interviews. So how do their experiences influence their perceptions of environmental changes? In working with Indigenous communities, it's very important to have participation and engagement throughout the entire process. And I did this first by asking for approval from the Tribal Council and reporting repeatedly to them, but also by developing an advisory council, and that helped me to adapt the measures that were developed, probably not with Indigenous peoples, to culturally appropriate ways of asking the question, but then also what was physically going on. The particular measure that I used for environmental changes was developed in Australia with the community of white people with experiencing drought. So I had a lot of different aspects to modify for the measure, and my community advisory committee helps guide me through that process. While I grew up in Louisiana and I am a tribal member, I was a child, and then I left and went to college and had life experiences. So I was away for nearly 20 years before going back and doing my dissertation. So that's another reason why I had to have a tribal or a community advisory committee. And I maintained a presence within the community throughout my time. My actual fieldwork was conducted from October to May. Back in 2015, I had approvals from the Washington University IRB and the Tribal Council IRB, and I partnered with the Dulac Community Center, who does the commodity distribution sites, and the Homa Council also were partners, and I was funded by a center at Washington University. So of the 17,000 tribal members in the 6 parish area, I knew that I wanted to concentrate in the area that loses the most land. This is Terrebonne Parish. It has approximately over 7,700 members. With power analysis, I determined the things that I wanted to look at, I needed about 160 people. So I interviewed 160 tribal members, male or female, who primarily did subsistence activities as their main source of income, and that were over 30. So that way I can interview people who had experience with changes and who would have lived long enough to see changes in their land if they were there. Of those 30, I asked people who identified as strongly or very strong, identifying as Homa, for follow-up qualitative interviews. This was a convenience sample, so I had to do heavy recruitment, and I did that in various ways, networking with my community advisory council and, flyers that we do as academics. But I also sat at bait shops, and I sat at this one wharf on the top making crab traps, because this person was a very key informant in the community, and people from various communities would often, after their day's catch, come to the wharf and talk to him, and he would have knowledge about things that's going on in the community, and they would have knowledge about different ways where the shrimp is catching that week, or if the oysters traps crops were being stolen, So there was lots of exchange of information. So sitting on this wharf, I couldn't just sit there as an academic with my computer or my papers. I had to actually do something. So I helped build crab traps and or babysat or did what I needed to do. And so there was lots of recruitment activities. To be also respectful, I gave participants a choice. I didn't make them drive 60 miles to the closest HOMA station. I met them where they needed to be, on a wharf or in their home or someone else's home. And one thing that a community advisory committee member said to me was, you wouldn't waste your academic professor's time for more than an hour. Don't waste our members' time for more than an hour. So I was incredibly respectful of their time, as I would be any of my professors at school. I'd also tried to use social work skills, actively listening and participating in the conversation. So I wasn't taking notes the whole time that I was having a conversation with them. I was interactive with them, but I took field notes afterwards. And then I did record audio record my qualitative interviews with their permission, and they were deleted as soon as they were transcribed. So that way, I wouldn't forget some of the major aspects of what they were saying. So on average, participants were about 55 years old, and about 43% were female. About 82% were in some form of a serious relationship, and 24% graduated from high school or had a high school degree or higher. About 61% spoke HOMA French as their first language, and 39% attended the Indian school. In many Indigenous communities, boarding school was a form of socialization or a forced assimilation, taking children and removing them to be educated in other communities. For HOMA, education was done until 1968 through missionaries. So the Indian schools were a Baptist school or Catholic school or a Episcopalian school, and the missionaries were the ones who provided education. On average, there was a normal distribution of income, but the most of the participants made less than $25,000 or less. So in looking at connection to place, many participants had very strong connection to place. In fact, about 97 participants reported connection as agree very strongly, agree strongly, or agree. Because there were so many people who had this strong connection to land, I couldn't use this in further statistical analysis. But I wanted to show you how strong people felt about their place. Participants observed changes in the land. The question was, how often have you personally observed or experienced environmental issues in Terrebonne Parish? And the green you can see is very frequently. So changes to the natural waterways, sinking of land, which is sea level rise, loss of native vegetation and animals, coastal soil erosion, damages to houses from repeated disasters, and loss of native fisheries. In fact, one participant, sorry, I need my glasses. I'll read it from here. One participant said that they called the coastal erosion cancer of the land. Talking about this one bayou that we were on, there used to be land on both sides. Now it's all open. It's washed away, and it's getting worse every year. And this other couple, they were a married couple, participants were talking about how the land and the water is after just a rainfall, not even related to any tropical storm or depression or hurricane, just a regular rainfall. They're saying the water got black, and the fish were popping up, meaning that there was limited oxygen in the bayou, and the fish were dying because of this rainfall. And looking at participant health, again, you can see a fairly normal distribution. Participants said their health was good to fair to poor, more so than very good or good. But when asked, in the last 30 days, how many days have you felt physically ill? Participants on average, a little over 6 days in the last 30 days not feeling well. How many days in the last 30 days have you felt emotionally or mentally ill? Again, over 6 days of the last 30 not feeling emotionally or mentally well. And then I flipped the question around, how many days in the last 30 days have you felt healthy and full of energy? And people just over, the average is just over 1. So less than 2 days a month, people feeling very healthy and full of energy. Questions about mental health went from screening, so they either screened for a mental health diagnosis of general anxiety disorder, depression, recurrent or current depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So about 28% of participants screened for anxiety, 14% for depression, and 24% for PTSD. And then looking at the relationship between environmental changes and health, you can see that there's statistically significant relationships between poor health days, how many days in the last 30 days have you felt physically ill or emotionally ill, and then how they felt their health was impacted because of changes to the environment. One participant said, it makes you wonder if the environment, I asked her how the changes in environment were impacting her health, And she said, you would think that with everybody dying down here, it makes you wonder if our soil is not contaminated or our air is not contaminated, or there's something that's slowly killing everybody down here. I did over 20 regressions, so I'll just show you the strongest fit. Regression, looking at mental health, you can see that controlling for other variables in the model, there was age had a statistically significant relationship with poor mental health, and that's meeting criteria for a diagnosis of mental health, anxiety, or PTSD. Gender was statistically associated with mental health, meaning that women were more likely than men to have meet criteria for diagnosis. The more participant experienced discrimination, the more likely they were to have mental health, meet criteria for mental health diagnosis. The more likely they were to identify as HOMA, the more likely they were to meet criteria for mental health diagnosis. The less social support, this is opposite. So the less social support one received, the more likely they were to meet criteria for mental health diagnosis. And then the more exposure they had to environmental changes, the more they observed or experienced these changes, the more likely they were to meet criteria for mental health. So overall, you can see from the quantitative findings that mental health had was the strongest predictor, and then discrimination was also a huge predictor for health and mental health, and that there was not a relationship between poor health days and environmental changes when looking at the logistic relationships. So in the qualitative interviews, there were several themes. One, we talked about the connection to land that you saw in the quantitative interviews. People strongly connect with their place. They talked about not only connecting with place, but because of practicing traditional ways, gaining medicines from the land, growing vegetables and fruit, everything that they needed to eat on the land, and raising livestock on the land. And so these things they remember fondly and wish that they could still do. And they talked about how they observed changes in the land through repeated disasters, chronic chronic land loss, climate change, and pollution. And then they also talked about the complex relationship between the oil field and the environment and their economy. And this is even reflected in the Homa flag. Shrimping season is not year-round. It's, our ancestors taught us you can't shrimp all year round because you won't have any. They won't ever grow, right? So it's typically from August to November. And in the past, participants received they can use a boat like the size from here to the screen, a pirogue, not very big, not motorized, and make enough to feed their family, house their family, and everything that they needed. But now, and they used to get $8, $10 for a pound of shrimp. So now they are only getting $1 or $2 for a pound of shrimp. And so if you think about that, when you go to a restaurant and you pay $25 for 6 shrimp on a plate, that cost does not really trickle down to those who harvest the shrimp. So in order to make ends meet and to sustain, participants had to get bigger boats that were motorized and that used these methods that they now know were non-sustainable methods called trolling, which dredges the bottom of the seabed floor, disrupting the entire ecosystem and not allowing for growth. So in the time that they're not shrimping, they had to find industry. And where do you go for an industry whenever you are not likely to have an education, and you probably weren't allowed to go into a bank until you were in your 30s or 40s because you weren't allowed into public institutions, is the industry that's calling to you, to promising you all kinds of money as a subcontractor, which is the oil field industry. And so they recognized they expressed concern and thoughtfulness about, yes, we know that the oil field has contributed to the land loss. But without the oil field, I would not have been able to feed my family in time and whenever I couldn't feed my family through my own subsistence activities. So they recognized this complex relationship. And between all of that, among all of that, is the presence of discrimination. So even, so I'll repeat it again, participants were not allowed to go to school, to formalized school until 1968, years after the Civil Rights Act. The first graduates were in the 70s of high school. And so you can see how that slowly trickles to other implications of poverty and socioeconomic status today, and how people still remember 2 generations later, remember that inability, that structural racism to not go into banks, not go into to formal school systems. So pulling all these themes together, I saw that there was this interconnectedness between the changes that's going on in the environment and loss of cultural practices and loss of medicines, ability to harvest. One participant said, in regards to medicine, we didn't go to a doctor or anything like that. I believe those days are gone. And how that impacts health and current livelihood. this also impacts, leads to a loss of ability to pass on cultural knowledge, because the way much of the cultural knowledge is passed on is through interacting with the land, through harvesting shrimp or fish or oysters, through raising livestock. And so for a while there was this lack of passing on cultural knowledge and these development of technologies. And so there was, many participants participated in the anthropogenic activities that contribute to environmental changes. But elders are saying, oh, we have to find new ways to harvest shrimp. We have to return to our old ways and use our knowledge with technology. For the interest of time, I'll skip a couple examples. And they said, well, in the past, we use the moon, we use the tide, and so there's a newer method of harvesting shrimp, which is called skimming, where you use nets that just touch the surface of the water. It's not disrupting the bottom ecosystem, and it's using the tide. So that means you're not going out there every day, and you're also not using the gasoline or the fuel, the fossil fuel to just go around the Gulf Coast looking for shrimp. They also have been allowed to maintain the land through burning marsh and doing activities that used to be able to practice regrowth strategies. The picture on the bottom is an example of property that had been left alone since before Hurricane Katrina. And now this land is thriving because they were able to burn the marsh and do some of the things that they used to be able to do. And this land is actually growing. It's one of the few areas that's not losing out of land. And then using technology to, instead of the palmetto thatched roofs, which were adequate in keeping water out, aren't so good at keeping the house in structure whenever there's Hurricane 4 coming through, or Category 4 hurricane coming through. And so the house on the modern dwelling houses, raised houses 12 to 14 feet, raised with wood that is sustainable, that can handle water sitting there and not mildew as fast. Although participants do laugh, because I don't know if you can see that there's an elevator there, and that's a FEMA requirement. If FEMA helps you rebuild your house in any way, then you have to have an elevator, regardless if there's a need or not. And so they laugh about it, because they're like, okay, 20 feet of water is coming in, but you want me to have this elevator here. But I don't know, they just think it's this super funny. And so I asked about adaptation activities. And for the most part, you could see in the colors in blue, they, almost always true or participating in them, but some not so much. And so the ones that they are participating in are the ones that are structured activities that are there in their community, run by local people. Or if they're given a number and they're told, if you see pollution while you're out on the Gulf, call this number, they'll do that. But they're not participating in the community town halls or the things that influence policy, because they still have this distrust of the government, this belief that their voice is not wanted, not heard, and won't be respected. And so there's just gaps in adaptation strategies and activities. Among the government, there's a lack of awareness of traditional ecological knowledge. There's environmental injustices that re-traumatize members, and there's not an awareness or an acceptance of that. And there's not even an honoring of tribal sovereignty on any meaningful level. But among tribal members, there's So there's sometimes an awareness of the adaptation or intervention activities, but sometimes not. And so tribal council members have acknowledged, okay, maybe we can do more to really integrate our tribal knowledge with science and modern technology, and an increased willingness to participate. This is, my perspective, my study using, scientific method, but it's limited. I used a convenient sample. It's not generalizable to the entire tribe, much less generalizable to all indigenous peoples. It's only generalizable to the people who participated in the study. I hope that it can form in future studies with indigenous peoples and in coastal communities. So thinking about this in the bigger picture, the most efficient thing would be for all communities experiencing vulnerability and environmental changes is, to have a national climate change plans that utilizes communities as stakeholders, as equal stakeholders. I'm not hopeful that that's going to happen in the next few years. So I'm thinking, what can social work contribute to this knowledge that geographers and environmental studies are doing so well at? And I thought, our use of community-based or community-engaged research, which uses indigenous principles of respecting our responsibility to our communities, our responsibilities to be knowledgeable of protocols that uses reciprocity guidelines and that honors relationships could be informative for environmental studies and engineering and folks who are really looking at physical adaptation processes and mechanisms. The community asset map is a wonderful tool that social workers use that recognize and honor assets of everyone from the formal institutions to the guy, the guy that's on the wharf making the crab traps, who has is a local holder of knowledge. There's the environmental justice framework. EPA has set their pretty sure it's still there. Their guideline of environmental justice is fair treatment of meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, income, national origin, ethnicity, with respect to developing, implementing, and enforcement of environmental policies. And so I just showed this. This is not part of my dissertation, but even among a marginalized community, there can be differences by class. So environmental justice is not just among race, but it can be by class and income. EPA has some environmental justice tools. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to go that fast. That hopefully that you can still utilize. That uses GIS mapping of toxic or environmental pollutants to map to your community using Census Bureau data that you can help plan in your communities. So I'm a firm believer that we can't, as one academic, do it alone, and we can't just in the academic tower do it alone, that we have to really have participation from the community, and they have to be a co-producer in order to make any meaningful changes. And I also want to acknowledge that indigenous communities all over the United States and the world are experiencing some kind of changes because of exploitation of natural resources. And I want to close with a poem that was written by our tribal chief to the island that we are being relocated from. It's called Ode de Chance. I know we must keep hope alive. We must walk on despite its loss. A people must stand strong. Together there is another river to cross. But how do you replace paradise? How do you make a memory real? How can your children see a place they can no longer touch or feel? So thank you to the YMCA and to the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, all those who financially and emotionally contributed to not only this presentation, but to the whole series. Thank you very much.
know that this displacement from northern Louisiana to Bonne Terre, which I have to point out is quite ironically named because it's slipping.
The good earth.
But I guess the Huma were already fisher people, so I'm trying to sort of get my head around the fact that the pain they suffer is not just the displacement, but actually the dead zone in the Gulf, which comes from here in our agricultural practices.
Mm-hmm.
So it's overwhelming, and I can see why people want to avoid that pain. And I don't like to think about it either, but I just wanted you to reflect. And I'm wondering whether it's true that the Huma were like a fisher people, and were probably ranged all the way into the Gulf and fished in their legacy, and that all of that has been pretty much stripped away. Well, not all of it, but most of it. I don't know how clear that is.
So I'll try. So the first part of his question was more like a statement and acknowledgement that not only in Homa losing land, but there's also challenges to harvesting that's from what's called the dead zone in the Gulf. And the dead zone is true. It's coastal hypoxia, and it's agricultural and toxic runoff that goes from the rivers down the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico. And this impacts harvest by a number of ways. The first off is the shrimp are unable to grow, so how much the quantity is. But then depending on the levels and the timing of the toxins that come in, it also impacts their growth stage, so the size. And then now people are wondering if it's even impacting the types of shrimp, because Homa were typically shrimping, they call it shrimping for either brown or white shrimp, but now that they're shrimp that was traditional deeper water shrimp that are coming in closer to the Gulf because the land is eroding, and those are being impacted as well. Second part of your question was I'm losing it. I lost. I just had it a second ago. Right. So I'm sure if you remember from any Indigenous studies class that you've had that until contact, Indigenous peoples didn't stay in one distinct location. Our ancestors moved according with season to different areas, and it wasn't just. I mean, at this moment, we assumed that we were, both there in the northern Mississippi and on the Gulf Coast, not just confined to one community, depending on the timing, and in the movement of the Mississippi and the timing of the year. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. First, I have a statement.
Yes.
When I walked in the Washington, D.C. climate change march, there were 200,000 people there, which is very helpful. The Dakota Native Americans were there, and they danced and spoke and had all their costumes on, and they thanked the American people for helping support them with the pipeline problem. Then I have a question.
Yeah.
On your screen, you had this diagram, it was a circular one, and you had harvest and medical treatment, I think. Did you mean that had cut out, that you now have that, or you don't? Okay.
I think your spouse gave you your answer. But so she asked if in the diagram, the interconnectedness cycle, if I was meaning that harvest was lost or if that's something that was gained. And unfortunately, harvest and medicines are both because they were dependent on the soil. So the quality of the soil is no longer fertile and they can't sustain the plants and the vegetables. It can't even sustain feeding the livestock.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. I was going too fast, but thank you for pointing that out. Oh, and then she also made a comment about how she marched in the climate change march and how the Dakotas in regalia thanked all their allies for participating and supporting standoff at Standing Rock. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Do the indigenous people have a sense or an understanding that it's the CO2 and the lifestyle of the rest of us that's causing this problem for them there with sea level rise and so on?
So my first disclaimer is that I cannot speak for all indigenous peoples. I can speak from an academic perspective, and that there's been many studies in Canada and Australia, New Zealand, with indigenous peoples for more than 20 years that document how indigenous peoples have been noticing the melting of permafrost, the changes and the styles of the leaves, and the migration routes and patterns of livestock, deer, and or not livestock, of animals, and so they have been trying to show that they have been noticing these, and those have been documented for sure. Thank you. Yes. I'm happy. I have a card here. I'm happy to email you. I'm still, this is my first year as a professor, so I'm still producing publications on my dissertation. So it's not open source yet. But if you have any interest in doing any data analysis, I'd love to have an RA. So. Yes, sir. So Canada did have a formal reparation with the Canadian government, and an aspect of that was not honoring tribal sovereignty and displacing from land, but then also an acknowledgement of human activities that have destroyed their lands. So in a sense, yes. I'm not aware of any in the United States. Yes.
You mentioned that your community was located on the coast of Louisiana for now. Have they heard that they may be moved again, or just because of the erosion?
No, there are government efforts to relocate at least portions of our community. The governor of Louisiana in 2015, after he was elected, his policy director wrote a grant to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and won a $20-something million grant to relocate our community without talking to, consulting with tribal communities. And so they're systematically, I just read in the paper this week, they hired this really expensive development firm to build this fancy housing development for tribal members. Yes. So I think there's trust on many different levels. I think I probably could have collected a surface level questions after my first year. But and it's different, I think, with everybody. I, have the, fortune of being from the community. And so my uncle took me to commodity distribution sites and said, this is my niece, so, because I was away for so long. And so there was a trust by proxy. But I still, had to go to coffee several times to their houses to gain trust. I was, there for 6 months on and off, specifically collecting my data, and I think that there's probably some levels that I haven't gained, and I think that it's a work in process, and I have to say that just because you gain somebody's trust doesn't mean, and this is with all communities, just because you gain somebody's trust, you have to keep it and you have to honor it, because it can go away super quickly. Any other questions? Great, thank you. Thank you.